Yui Komori was an ugly good-for-nothing girl sent from church to live with some hot vampires brothers desperate to make her their plaything. However, before any of this, Yui Komori traveled through a gloomy evening as the sun dipped below the horizon. She finally arrived at a large, old mansion hidden away in a dense forest. As she approached, dark clouds rolled in, bringing a fierce downpour and sudden flashes of lightning. Seeking shelter, she quickly knocked on the mansion door, calling out for anyone inside. Just then, the door creaked open by itself. Thinking the owners had forgotten to expect her, she stepped in and called out again, but there was no reply. Then she spotted a boy with striking red hair, lying on a couch, appearing to be asleep. Curious, Yui walked closer and gently touched him, but his skin felt icy. She couldn't feel his pulse and, alarmed, reached for her phone to call an ambulance. Before she could dial, the boy suddenly opened his eyes, clearly annoyed at being woken up. Startled, Yui backed away, confused, because she was sure his heart wasn't beating. But just as she tried to leave, he caught her arm, making her sit back down beside him. Introducing himself as Ayato, he cryptically suggested she should already know why she was here. He leaned in closer, almost as if he intended to bite her, when another voice interrupted them. Ryeji, Ayato's older brother, entered and scolded him for treating a guest so rudely in the mansion's entrance hall. Ryeji advised Ayato to move his activities elsewhere, somewhere more private. Relieved by the interruption, Yui approached Ryeji, explaining that her father had sent her to stay at the mansion. Ryeji looked puzzled, as he was unaware of her arrival, and turned to Ayato, who also seemed clueless. Instead of answering, Ayato teased her, calling her pancake and blaming her for not introducing herself properly. Before they could discuss further, Ryeji called for the butler, who appeared instantly and took Yui's luggage. At that moment, another brother, Leto, appeared, commenting on how adorable she looked. He leaned in close to Yui, playfully licking her cheek, making her jump in fright. Just then, another brother, Kanato, joined, expressing a desire to taste her as well, saying she seemed sweet. Ryeji reminded his brothers to show some respect, but they only teased further, suggesting that something sweet should indeed be sampled. This led to a minor argument among the brothers, with Ayato claiming he should be Yui's first everything. Another brother, Subaru, frustrated by Ayato's arrogance, finally joined, irritated at the ruckus that disturbed his sleep. When he demanded Yui answer him first, she stammered, feeling both intimidated and confused by how quickly the brothers appeared around her, thinking she must have somehow misunderstood the situation. Yui tried to excuse herself and leave the mansion, but Ryeji stopped her, saying he wanted to verify her story first. Finally, the eldest brother, Shu, entered the scene and mentioned that he had received a vague message recently. Someone from a church had called, informing him they'd be receiving a guest and instructing the brothers to treat her with respect as a potential bride. This revelation stunned Yui. She hadn't heard anything about being a bride. Nervous, she wanted to contact her father, but when she turned to get her phone, Ayato had already snatched it away. Moments later, Subaru crushed it, telling her to get lost. The other brothers, however, were far from ready to let her leave. Leto whispered something unsettling in her ear, and Yui, growing more frightened, backed away, losing her balance. She scraped her knee, and the sight of blood seemed to excite the vampire brothers, their gazes intensifying. Desperate, Yui held out a small cross she carried, hoping it might protect her. Shu smirked at the gesture, while Ryeji scoffed, explaining that legends about vampires fearing garlic, crosses, and sunlight were mere fairy tales. Realizing her attempt to scare them off had failed, Yui bolted, trying to find an exit. She stumbled into Kanato, who darkly threatened her, only heightening her panic. She ran to a nearby phone, but the cord had been cut, and Leto was right behind her, closing in fast. Racing to the front door, Yui tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. Ayato watched her struggle, amused. Yui managed to shake him off and dashed upstairs, finally finding a room with a broken lock. She slipped inside, hoping it would give her a moment to catch her breath. As she walked to the window, she saw a mysterious woman with purple hair staring back at her. Yui's heart ached as if in recognition, and she stumbled back, accidentally knocking over a few books. When she looked again, the woman had vanished. Nearby, she found a notebook with a picture of herself as a child, held by her father. Leafing through it, she read an entry that revealed she wasn't his biological daughter, but he cherished her deeply regardless. Shocked and overwhelmed, Yui barely had time to process this discovery before she heard the brothers' footsteps. They were all there, surrounding her. Ryeji reminded her that the room was meant to be sealed off, and he wondered aloud how she had managed to enter. As she looked around at the brothers' intense expressions, they closed in, making her feel truly trapped. Rieji then informed her that there was one undeniable fact she needed to accept: she could never leave this place. Before she could react, Ayato pinned her down once more, baring his fangs as he moved in close. All Yui could do was close her eyes and pray for deliverance. The following morning, Yui awoke with a sense of relief, realizing she hadn't been bitten. But then she noticed something odd. She didn't remember changing her clothes. Yesterday's strange events flashed through her mind, and she felt both confused and uneasy. She knew she had to find a way to contact her father, as she still didn't understand why he'd sent her to this eerie place. Just then, she was startled by Leto, who appeared on her bed out of nowhere. He teased her, commenting on how she looked in her nightwear and even implied that her scent was irresistible. Just as she tried to brush him off, Ayato shoved Leto away, insisting that Yui belonged to him. Before anything else could happen, Rieji appeared, telling them all to quit messing around, or they'd be late for school. Yui was surprised to hear they attended school at night, but Rieji firmly told her that she would need to adjust to their unusual schedule. He also instructed her to get into her school uniform, and in a moment, the brothers vanished, leaving her alone. Yui looked at her rosary and wondered if this was a good opportunity to sneak back into the room where she'd discovered the diary. But as soon as she opened the door, she found Ayato waiting outside, reminding her that she still needed to change clothes. Later, Yui and the brothers rode together to school in a luxurious limousine. She noticed the silence between the brothers and wondered if they got along, as none of them spoke much. Ayato soon began teasing her again, calling her pancake. When Yui protested, he jokingly threatened to take a bite. Rieji, overhearing them, sternly reminded Ayato that any feeding should be done privately in his room. Then, Rieji offered Yui a glass of 100% cranberry juice, though it felt more like a warning than a gift. He explained that she should drink it daily to enhance the taste of her blood, hinting that she was little more than prey to them. Yui's hands shook as she held the glass, realizing the frightening reality of her situation. Once they arrived at school, Rieji informed Yui that she was in the same class as Ayato and Kanato, advising her to behave unless she wanted a punishment. Nervously, Yui complied and followed them to class. The day's activity was food preparation in the home economics room. Ayato pulled her aside, deciding to skip the class to make takoyaki together. They cooked the takoyaki, and Yui even got to enjoy some. When they finished, she started cleaning up and asked Ayato for help, but when he suddenly appeared close behind her, she grew anxious and tried to run. Ayato, however, was clearly interested in more than just takoyaki. He wanted her blood. With a grin, he grabbed her face, examining her skin and remarking how flawless it looked without any marks. Ignoring her pleas, he leaned in and bit her neck, savoring her blood and declaring it was the sweetest he'd ever tasted. Despite her struggling, Ayato was too captivated by the taste, feeding on her even as tears ran down her cheeks. He continued until Rieji walked in, visibly annoyed and scolding Ayato for his lack of restraint, especially in public. As Rieji walked away, he told Ayato to make sure Yui returned home safely. Later, Yui regained consciousness and backed away from Ayato, terrified. She tried to get away from him, but he quickly blocked her path. Picking her up, Ayato carried her to the mansion's pool. Ignoring her cries, he threw her into the water, demanding that she admit he was superior to everyone and that she belonged to him. Yui struggled in the water, unable to swim, and began to sink. This seemed to trigger an old memory for Ayato, reminding him of a time he'd nearly drowned as a child. Seeing her struggle, he dove into the water, breathing air into her lungs through a kiss. But even after pulling her from the water, he wasn't finished. He bit her neck again, letting her blood mix with the water. Yui begged him to stop, and after drinking his fill, he finally lifted her out of the pool, wrapping her in a towel. Without saying another word, he walked away, leaving her there to recover alone. Later that evening, Yui managed to sneak back into the room where she had previously found her father's journal. Hoping to find answers, she opened the journal again, only to be shocked. All the pages were now blank. The words and photos she had seen before had vanished, leaving her with more questions and a deep feeling of dread. At dinner, Yui sat quietly, glancing at each of the brothers. At one point, Leto got up and tried to feed her, but Rieji quickly scolded him, saying it was improper to get up during a meal. Annoyed, Shu stood up and walked out, thinking the whole scene was a waste of time. Rieji, equally frustrated, commented on how Shu had always been spoiled, thanks to their privileged lives. After that, he dismissed everyone from the table, but not before criticizing Yui for her terrible table manners. Later, in her room, Yui sighed and reached for her father's diary. To her disappointment, it was still blank. The only clue left was her photo with him. Suddenly, Ayato appeared, startling her. He was there for one reason: to drink her blood. Yui tried to find an excuse, saying she needed to take a bath and had been feeling weak lately. But Ayato wasn't interested in excuses. He left a stamp mark on her, intending to add more, only stopping because he didn't want her fainting before her bath. In the bathroom, Yui examined the marks left on her skin. Then she heard water sloshing in the bathtub. It was Shu, sitting fully dressed with his headphones still on. She asked why he hadn't undressed, and he teased her, saying maybe she should do it for him if she was so curious.
Yeah, boy.
Embarrassed, she told him she just wanted to take a bath and was surprised by how different the brothers were despite being family. Shu casually explained the family tree. He and Ryeji shared the same mother, while Ayato, Kanato, and Leto were triplets from another mother, and Subaru had a different mother as well. As Shu went under the water, Yui instinctively reached for him, which brought back a childhood memory of fire and loss for him. When he realized he was hurting Yui, instead of letting her go, he pulled her into the bath with him. He held her close and remarked on her pale skin, suggesting that just one bite would make her blood bright red. He noticed the marks from Ayato and called him possessive. Yui, clearly upset, whispered that she thought Shu was different. Shu reminded her that he was still a vampire like the others. He took a bite and told her he would show her a whole new world, one that would make her heart race and her skin warm as his fangs touched her. After pulling back, he warned her to think carefully before reaching out to him again. Back in her room, Yui thought she'd finally have some peace, but Ayato was waiting for her. He intended to drink her blood again, but upon seeing Shu's marks on her neck, he grew furious and left to confront his brother. Marching downstairs, Ayato challenged Shu to a game of darts. Shu initially refused, saying it was too much effort, but Leto encouraged them, suggesting the winner could have Yui. Ryeji joined in, doubting Shu would take the challenge, and mockingly said Shu's photo should be next to spineless in the dictionary. Ryeji's taunt finally got Shu's attention. They began the game, and Shu only needed one more shot to win. Calmly, he landed the shot, claiming victory with ease. Walking past Yui afterward, Shu reminded her of his perspective. Humans were nothing more than prey. One day at school, Yui finally found a phone she could use to contact someone. But just as she picked it up, she noticed Kanato watching her. He had been hanging around, claiming he was thirsty and even said his stuffed bear, Teddy, was thirsty too. Yui, wanting to be polite, tried to apologize to Teddy, but Kanato snapped at her, saying she had no right to act like she knew his bear. Honestly, Kanato was Yui's least favorite brother. Trying to be kind, she returned with a cup of coffee for him, but he angrily slapped it out of her hands, saying he hated bitter things and only liked sweets. He seemed offended that she hadn't known his preferences. Yui started to protest about the coffee being spilled, but Kanato cut her off, calling her worthless and insisting she had no right to argue. She quickly apologized, but that seemed to irritate him even more. Kanato demanded that if she wasn't genuinely sorry, she shouldn't even apologize. Then, almost as if flipping a switch, he softened and pretended to worry if the hot coffee had splashed on her hands. Before she could pull back, he suddenly leaned in and licked her fingers, causing her to freeze in shock. He walked away, telling her she needed to make more of an effort to understand him. Yui then asked him if he'd seen her bag, only for Kanato to reveal he'd put it on the roof as a form of punishment. Before leaving, he muttered to Teddy that the phone she'd tried to use had been broken for weeks, so her attempt to reach out was pointless. When Yui goes up to the roof to grab her bag, she hears Leto softly talking to himself. He expresses his love, saying it will last forever, whether she wants it or not. He remembers everything about her voice, her scent, and everything else. But then he notices her and asks who is there. Yui tries to hide, but it's too late. Since he catches her listening, Leto decides she deserves a punishment for eavesdropping. He pushes her against the wall and asks where she wants him to bite her, choosing her neck for a quick taste. As he drinks, he seems to feel something strange but then pauses, giving Yui the chance to push him away and escape. Desperate to call for help, Yui ran to a phone booth and dialed her father's number, only to hear Leto's voice on the other end. She turned and saw him across the street holding a cell phone, smirking at her. Realizing she couldn't get away, she tried to run, but he caught up to her with ease. Just then, they both overheard the news, where a politician named Taugo Sakamaki was about to announce Japan's new foreign policy. Yui realized this man was their father. Without thinking, she blurted out his real name, Karl-Heinz, before fainting, leaving Leto puzzled about who she really was. When Yui woke up, she found herself back in her room. This time, she managed to slip out of the mansion, discovering that the door wasn't locked. She went to a nearby cathedral, kneeling down to pray for guidance. She softly questioned if this was yet another test for her and if her father was truly safe. But soon, Leto appeared, sneering at her for praying. He told her that no one would listen to her prayers, claiming that God was just an illusion created by people. Holding on to her faith, Yui tried to ignore him and continued to pray for strength. However, Leto only laughed harder, calling her foolish for believing in something he saw as meaningless. Still, he found her innocence intriguing. Determined to break her spirit, he pinned her down, wanting to reveal her hidden desires. Yui, appalled that he would behave like this in a sacred place, tried to resist, but he was much too strong. Ignoring her anger, he told her he would make her his own. His fangs pierced her thigh, drawing blood that trickled down his face. As he fed, he shared a shocking secret. The very church she trusted had sent her to him. Yui tried to deny it, insisting that it couldn't be true, but Leto reminded her that they were the ones who had dropped her off at his mansion. Feeling betrayed and helpless, tears filled her eyes as Leto leaned in for another bite, unbothered by her distress. The following day, Yui was busy tending to the roses in the garden, still haunted by Leto's shocking words about the church supposedly abandoning her. She tried to shake off the thought, telling herself it couldn't be true. Then, Kanado suddenly appeared and demanded she follow him somewhere he'd chosen. He led her to his mother's grave, where he started talking about his love for the cold, lifeless feeling of graves, and the chilling silence that didn't care about anyone's fears. Yui was taken aback when Kanado revealed he was the one who had killed his own mother. He then asked her to place flowers on the grave, which she did, trying to leave quickly afterward. Her attempt to go made Kanado furious. He felt insulted that she would leave so quickly after he'd invited her to be there. He angrily grabbed the flowers, smashing them against the grave. Stepping closer, he glared at her, and Yui, overwhelmed by his rage, stumbled back and fell. Seeing her vulnerable, Kanado seemed pleased by her frightened state. He told her to crawl in the dirt and cry for forgiveness. Suddenly, he pinned her down, ready to feed. Watching her recoil, he mused about whether mortal women were offended if they weren't kissed first. Though he found it bothersome, he decided to give her a kiss before drinking her blood. He noticed a strange familiarity in her scent, yet his hunger for her blood only grew stronger. After struggling free, Yui encountered Subaru, who saw his uncle Richter briefly appear and then vanish in a swirl of wind, ominously mentioning something called the Awakening. Subaru looked puzzled, clearly not understanding what it meant. Later, Yui returned to her room but heard odd sounds coming from the room next door. Curiously, she peeked in and found Ryeji struggling in his sleep. When she reached out to touch him, he woke up, surprised that her scent was what had stirred him from his nightmare. She apologized, but Ryeji actually seemed relieved, admitting that waking up this way was better than staying in his bad dream. Standing up, he went to prepare tea, but when Yui tried to ask for a cup, he sharply told her to stop being so self-centered, making it clear he wasn't about to make tea for her. Instead, he allowed her to enjoy just the scent. The silence became uncomfortable, so Yui attempted to make conversation, asking about his room and whether his brother Shu had ever used it. Hearing Shu's name visibly irritated Ryeji. Though he wouldn't explain his hatred for his brother, he briefly looked out the window, a flicker of pain crossing his face as he remembered how their mother had always favored Shu. Despite his annoyance, Ryeji finally softened, handing Yui a cup of tea. But as soon as she took a sip, her body went numb, and she dropped the glass. Ryeji quickly forced another antidote down her throat, helping her stand up, but her hand had been injured. Taking her hand, he tasted her blood and felt a strange sense of familiarity. Realizing his hunger, his gaze darkened, and he pushed her against the wall. Yui, scared, pleaded with him to stop, but he reminded her that no one was there to hear her cry. To him, humans were merely vessels for blood. But something about Yui made him want to give her more pleasure than any of her other experiences. As he drank from her, she pushed him away, which only irritated him. Threatening her, he said he'd bind her wounded hand so tightly it would eventually decay and fall off. Ryeji seemed to find delight in the idea of her suffering and dying in despair. However, as he recalled the death of his mother, how she had died peacefully with a smile, it filled him with resentment. He couldn't bear the thought of Yui meeting a similar peaceful end. For him, she was going to experience nothing but agony under his control. One day, Yui found Kanado sitting on a ledge, singing a haunting song that gave her chills. Worried about him, she urged him to get down because it looked dangerous. Kanado just chuckled, noticing her mix of worry and fear, which he thought made her look cute. At the same time, he seemed bothered by her concern, as if he found it self-important. He told her he'd get down, which relieved her. But to her shock, instead of climbing down carefully, he simply let himself fall, hitting the ground with a loud thud. Horrified, Yui called out his name, afraid he was hurt. But being a vampire, a fall like that didn't harm him at all. Standing up, he casually remarked that he wished he could die so easily. Kanado then insisted on taking her to a place he liked, leading her to a strange room filled with eerie wax figures. These lifeless statues gave her an uneasy feeling. Kanado used the unsettling atmosphere to tease her, saying that one day he could make her as still and lifeless as one of these figures. He backed her up against the wall, baring his fangs, and it seemed he was about to bite her. Then, in a disturbing twist, he revealed that each wax figure in the room was once a living person sacrificed as a bride for vampires like him. Gripping her neck, he seemed ready to turn her into the next lifeless figure. Just then, Ayato appeared in the doorway. He casually told Kanado that Ryeji was looking for him. Ayato's timing saved Yui, but he hadn't come to rescue her. He was simply too tired to feed on her himself. Inside the mansion, Yui ran into Subaru, who bluntly warned her that she would die if she continued staying there. He told her it was her only chance to escape. Determined, she went to her room and began packing her belongings. But when she saw a photo of her father tucked under her diary, she stopped, realizing she couldn't leave just yet. She wanted to stay and uncover the truth about her father and why she was here. Later, she went to find Subaru and asked if he knew anything about her father. Seeing her so downhearted, Subaru was reminded of his own mother, who often had a similar sad expression. He handed Yui a silver knife, explaining that it was powerful enough to kill vampires if it was driven straight into the heart. He wouldn't tell her why he gave her such a weapon, only that his mother had often pushed him to murder someone. Returning to her room, Yui found Leto waiting for her. He noticed the knife Subaru had given her and took it, pressing it to his own heart. Confused, Yui asked why he would do that. Leto explained that, for vampires, allowing someone to kill them was the ultimate confession of love, because it meant trusting them with the only thing that could end an immortal's life. Moving closer, he pinned her against the wall, telling her she couldn't possibly understand what it felt like to love someone so intensely that it turned into hatred. He wanted to break her spirit, taunting her to admit that she desired him and that there was no God to save her. Even though she was at his mercy, Yui chose to stay strong in her faith, refusing to let him break her spirit, even if life with these vampires was painful. Leto found her stubbornness amusing and pulled back, laughing. He admitted that while he had once only been interested in her blood, he now felt a strange desire for something more. Yui woke up to the sound of a storm, rain pouring heavily outside her window. She peered out and saw a mysterious woman with purple hair, who looked back and smirked. The sight sent a strange shiver through Yui, and suddenly she collapsed to the floor. When she opened her eyes, she found herself wandering through an underground hallway, feeling as if she were in a trance. She began hearing the laughter of young boys and came across a memory of Kanado, who was crying about the bats he had caught escaping. His twin brothers, Leto and Ayato, were trying to comfort him, promising to catch the bats again. Their mother, Cordelia, soon appeared, scolding Ayato harshly. Yui recognized her as the same woman she had just seen in the garden. Cordelia demanded Ayato go inside to study, though he was visibly frustrated from his constant lessons. He didn't understand why his brothers could play while he was stuck with work. His mother, however, became enraged, reminding him that he was the successor and had no choice but to aim to be the best. She warned him that failing would mean losing his place as her son, even suggesting that he would be punished by being abandoned at the bottom of a cold, lonely lake. As Ayato hurried off, Cordelia turned her affection to her little songbird Kanado and her beloved pianist Leto. Yui then found herself witnessing another memory, where she saw a young Ryeji and his brother Shu with their mother, Beatrix. Shu, who had just found a puppy, showed it to his mother with excitement, but Beatrix was disappointed. She reminded Shu that he was the family's eldest son and needed to act responsibly, ordering the butler to take the puppy away. Shu ran off in frustration, leaving Ryeji hoping to gain his mother's attention. He tried to impress her by showing off his studies, but she ignored him completely. Yui took a step forward and saw a single white rose lying on the ground. When she picked it up, its thorns pricked her finger. She then noticed a path lined with white roses, and as she walked along it, she saw Subaru staring at his mother Krista, who was confined in a high tower. Moving further, she came across Cordelia again, this time with the boy's uncle, Richter. He was complimenting her, calling her beautiful and graceful. She flirted back, asking him to stay by her side and whisper sweet words to her, a scene that clearly angered Ayato, who stood watching from afar. Suddenly, everything around Yui froze, and her surroundings turned black and white. Cordelia, however, shifted her gaze directly to Yui, causing a tight, painful feeling in her chest. Yui collapsed to the floor and, when she came to, found Ayato standing over her in the underground waterway. She asked him about a door nearby, but he ignored her question, focusing instead on the cut on her finger from the rose. Just then, Leto appeared, drawn to the scent of her blood. Seeing both vampires ready to feed, Yui tried to escape through a gate, but it was locked. Realizing there was no way out, she reluctantly allowed them to feed on her. As Ayato drank from her, the pain in Yui's chest grew, forcing him to pull back. Leto moved in for his own taste, but shortly after, Ayato grew bored and frustrated, deciding to leave. Late one night, as Yui wandered near the rose garden, she heard beautiful piano music drifting through the air. Curious, she followed the sound upstairs and found Leto at the piano, playing passionately. He smiled, pleased that she had come to hear him. Ignoring his usual flirtatious remarks, Yui asked about the mysterious woman with purple hair she kept seeing. Leto immediately fell silent, his hands stopping on the keys. Just then, Kanado and Ayato appeared, surprised to see her there as well. Yui seized the moment and asked them what had happened to their mother. Ayato responded with a dark story, sharing that on a night marked by a red moon, Cordelia, his mother, had been panicked and screaming, blood covering her clothes and staining Ayato's shirt. Despite her terror, Ayato was tempted by the sweetness of her blood, but Cordelia managed to escape to the room where Leto was playing piano. She begged Leto to save her from Ayato, Leto agreed, taking her to a secluded spot. Cordelia, relieved, even confessed her love for him, but was shocked when Leto suddenly pushed her off a ledge, sending her falling into a bed of roses where she lay still, her body pierced by thorns. Kanado, seeing his mother's lifeless body, gently touched her, confused about why she was so cold and unresponsive. Desperate to warm her, he lit candles around her, watching as the flames danced over her motionless form, laughing softly as if the fire would somehow bring her back. Horrified by the story, Yui stumbled away, fleeing outside but tripping in her rush. She wanted nothing more than to escape this place, but Subaru appeared, coldly reminding her that she had chosen to stay when she had a chance to leave. Even though he knew what the triplets had done to their mother, Subaru remained indifferent. She then reached out to him, asking why he had given her the knife. This question seemed to stir something in him, and he grew tense, warning her not to dig too deeply. Yui then remembered the vision she had seen of Subaru as a child, where his mother was locked away in a tower. She asked him about her, which only made Subaru more frustrated. He gripped her arm tightly, asking what she expected from someone as polluted and powerless as he believed himself to be. Then, in a rare moment of gentleness, he pulled her close, embracing her softly. But the intimacy turned darker as he leaned in, biting her neck. The taste of her blood was so intoxicating that he went for another bite, holding her even tighter. Barely audible, Subaru revealed that he had given her the knife so she could use it against him if she ever wanted to end his life. But seeing her hesitation, he coldly suggested that she could even use it to end her own. As the morning sun crept in, Yui lay in bed, replaying Subaru's words in her mind. Suddenly, she felt the bed shift and was surprised to find Ayato lying beside her. He quietly told her not to look at him, pulling her close before closing his eyes as if to sleep. But her peace was quickly shattered when she heard a man's voice calling out to Cordelia. The voice sent chills down her spine, her heart racing and her chest aching. Later, hoping fresh air might clear her mind, Yui went for a walk. Near an old building, a swarm of bats suddenly flew at her, surrounding her until Shu commanded them to settle down. He asked why she was out there, so she nervously shared that she kept hearing the voice of a woman who wasn't there, making her feel unsettled and unlike herself. Shu only mocked her unease, shoving her down and biting her neck. As he drank, he noticed something unusual. Her blood seemed different, almost signaling something he called the awakening. He wiped her blood off his lips, noting how warm and rich it was, though she tried to push him away. He found her scent irresistible, and as more blood flowed from her wrists, he couldn't resist taking another taste. Curious and frightened, Yui asked Shu what he meant by awakening. Shu, not interested in explaining, said Richter was nearby and could answer her questions. As Shu left, Richter approached her, apologizing for the roughness of his nephews. He offered to answer anything she wanted to know, and Yui asked why she was brought to the mansion, why she was chosen, and how her father was involved with the sacrificial brides. Smirking, Richter dismissed her concerns as conceited, explaining she wasn't chosen, she was simply at the right age and easy to capture. Her father had nothing to do with it. This revelation left her feeling somewhat relieved, but soon after, she was struck by another sharp pain in her chest, causing her to collapse. Richter watched her with excitement, finally seeing what he had waited so long for. His beloved Cordelia revived. He spoke to her gently, coaxing her into a trance, and led her to a hidden room behind a bookcase. Inside, Yui found Cordelia's blood-stained dress, preserved like a relic. As Yui touched it, blood stained her hand, and she gasped as she saw a vision of Cordelia's hand reaching toward her. In that instant, her entire demeanor changed. She turned and smirked at Richter. Delighted, Richter bowed deeply, recognizing the return of his beloved Cordelia. Yui, now possessed by Cordelia's spirit, laughed wickedly, admiring her blood-stained hand. One by one, the brothers felt a shift in the air, sensing something was wrong. Ayato, feeling especially uneasy, rushed to Yui's room, where he found her cross-lying abandoned on her bed, a haunting sign that Yui as they knew her might be lost forever. In the dim glow of a balcony under the night sky, Cordelia and Richter stood together, reminiscing about the joyful moments they had shared long ago, particularly their midnight dances. Although Richter felt some regret that Cordelia was technically his sister-in-law, he couldn't deny his love for her. He had once fought his brother, Karl-Heinz, over her and lost, leading him to wander the world for centuries, trying to forget her. Cordelia reassured him, saying he owed Karl-Heinz nothing and that it was pointless to dwell on the past. After all, she was alive once more. Just then, Ayato arrived, clearly uneasy and frustrated by the sight of his mother, Cordelia, now inhabiting Yui's body. Cordelia barely acknowledged him, as she was not yet fully accustomed to her new body and could feel Yui's soul attempting to resist her possession. Calmly, she walked past him, dismissing his questions. Ayato demanded answers, and Richter explained, on the night of Cordelia's death, he had tried to save her. She knew her body was beyond rescue, so she begged him to remove her heart and preserve it until it could be implanted into a new vessel. She knew Kanado was coming to burn her remains, so she urged Richter to act swiftly. In the pouring rain, Richter fulfilled her wish, removing her heart with a solemn promise to bring her back. The heart within Yui now was none other than Cordelia's, meaning Yui's body was merely a temporary home for Cordelia's spirit. Eventually, Cordelia's presence would grow strong enough to completely erase Yui's soul. Hearing this, Ayato grew tense and approached Cordelia, who was gazing into the lake. She turned and taunted him, daring him to kill her once again. Ayato coldly reminded her of his past struggles with swimming, a skill Cordelia had forced him to master. She took all the credit for his improvement, laughing at his threat to push her into the lake. Confident in her own swimming skills, she assumed it would be easy to escape. But as she was plunged into the water, Yui's body, lacking Cordelia's memories, struggled to stay afloat. As Ayato began to walk away, he heard Yui's panicked cries. She had regained control and called out for help, confused and choking as the water pulled her down. She frantically asked Ayato how she ended up in the lake and why she was wearing a strange dress. Ignoring her questions, Ayato felt a powerful thirst and immediately began to drink her blood, reveling in its fullness. He felt a fierce possessiveness, craving more with each taste, and claimed Yui as his own, declaring that her blood, body, heart, and soul belonged entirely to him. He demanded her total devotion, wanting her life and blood to be solely his. Before he could continue, however, his brothers, Leto and Kanado, arrived, drawn by the scent of her blood, which was richer and sweeter than ever as Cordelia's spirit stirred within her. Yui seized the moment to flee. Ayato, not wanting to share her blood, blocked his brother's approach, and Yui sprinted back to her room, locking herself inside. Desperate, she pulled a silver dagger from her drawer, but before she could decide what to do, Subaru appeared. Overcome by her scent, he gripped her close, drinking deeply from her shoulder. Her blood was so irresistible that he wanted to make her feel his fangs sink in. With each bite, she grew weaker, and finally, unable to bear it, she collapsed from the heavy blood loss. Despite her growing fear and confusion, she didn't want to keep the dagger, uncertain of its purpose. However, Subaru left it by her side, perhaps sensing she might need it soon. Later, Richter explained that her blood was driving the brothers mad. This transformation, triggered by Cordelia's partial awakening, had heightened their instincts to an extreme, making each brother intensely possessive. If Cordelia continued to rise within Yui, it might even drive the brothers to kill one another in a desperate fight to claim her blood and body. Overwhelmed, Yui asked what she should do, and Richter advised her to relax, let her mind clear, and embrace her fate, as everything happening to her was part of her destiny. In that instant, a gust of wind burst through the window and Yui's chest tightened. She saw Cordelia's form outside, and as her spirit commanded, Yui found herself compelled to obey. She fell to her knees in a trance, and at last, Cordelia's presence completely took over, claiming Yui's body and soul entirely as her own. Cordelia and Richter sat together, laughing as she sipped her drink on a couch. Ryeji walked in, stunned to see her alive again. Cordelia casually remarked that he looked so much like Karl-Heinz, especially when they first met, and encouraged him not to be so stiff and distant. As he approached, Ryeji observed that scheming was as natural to her as breathing. Cordelia agreed, declaring that she wanted to stay vibrant and alive because she despised nothing more than boredom. It was the worst curse for an immortal. Ryeji dryly responded that boredom didn't suit her, though death did. Instead of being offended, Cordelia took this as a compliment and invited him to sit and chat, but he stayed back. Curious, she commented that he reminded her of his mother, Beatrix, who had hidden her emotions and ultimately died a sad, useless death. Her words hit a nerve with Ryeji, but she went further, saying that Beatrix had never loved him as much as she loved Shu. Ryeji realized how skillfully Cordelia had used similar manipulations to turn his father, Karl-Heinz, against his brother, Richter. She openly admitted her role in ruining their once strong bond, and then approached Ryeji, removing his glasses to get a clearer look at his eyes, which reminded her of Karl-Heinz. She softly touched his face and revealed her plan to return and take revenge on Karl-Heinz by taking his life. When Ryeji asked if this was because his father never truly loved her, she told him that killing Karl-Heinz was, in fact, her twisted way of showing her love. Ryeji dismissed this as her selfish way of pushing her feelings on others. Annoyed by his resistance, she silenced him with a kiss. He held her briefly, but when he asked about her intentions with Richter, she confidently replied that her uncle would never refuse her. Ryeji pulled away, expressing that he had no interest in women who lacked morals. Offended, Cordelia slapped him. And just then, Leto walked in, amused by the scene and teasing that he thought the next time he'd see his mother would be in the afterlife. She teased him back, apologizing for disappointing him. Kanado soon entered, and Cordelia affectionately called him her little songbird, asking him to sing like he used to. However, he was more focused on understanding how she had managed to come back to life. Subaru stormed in, furious, and demanded that both Cordelia and Richter leave because they didn't belong there. Richter retorted by reminding Subaru of his failure to protect his own mother, which infuriated Subaru enough to try and attack him. However, Richter was far stronger, easily fending off Subaru's punches. Observing the scene, Shu remarked that despite Richter's strength, he was still no match for Karl-Heinz. Growing irritated with the brothers, Cordelia commanded Richter to dispose of them with Subaru's silver knife, knowing a stab to the heart would disintegrate a vampire. She tempted Richter with the promise of making him the family's new head if he followed through. However, Richter responded skeptically, pointing out that she'd already promised him power simply for bringing her back. Trying to charm him, she urged him again to kill the boys quickly, but he saw through her desperation. He informed her that she was now useless to him in her weakened form. All he needed was the heart inside Yui, as that would grant him power without her help. Realizing his betrayal, Cordelia nervously backed away, asking if he had been using her all along, and suddenly understood that she was the pawn in his game, not the other way around. Richter pulled her in, preparing to drain her energy, but Ayato interrupted, declaring that he wouldn't let anyone take what belonged to him. Richter quickly drew his sword and struck at Ayato, who dodged. Leto tossed Ayato another sword, and the two engaged in a fierce duel, fighting for control over Yui's body. Ayato was quickly overpowered, receiving a deep slash in his shoulder and collapsed to his knees. Richter prepared for a final blow, but just then, Yui's voice called out to Ayato, distracting Richter. Taking advantage of this, Yui grabbed a silver dagger from Richter, trembling as she held it toward her chest, determined to end her life to save everyone from further harm. With one final act of courage, she drove the dagger into her heart. Despite her actions, Cordelia wasn't finished. Her spirit took control of Yui's body once again, rendering Yui's self-sacrifice futile. Cordelia's awakening continued, her presence growing stronger even as Yui's soul faded, making it clear that Yui's attempt to resist had only delayed the inevitable. Cordelia's return to power was unstoppable. Yui lay motionless, bloodied, and unconscious in Ayato's arms. Leto stared in disbelief, still shocked that Yui had gathered the courage to stab herself in the heart. The brothers stood in silence, unsure of what would happen next. Subaru, seeing Yui in such a state, carefully removed the dagger from her chest, hoping it might help in some way. Meanwhile, Richter, badly wounded and struggling to breathe, was making his way through an underground water tunnel, refusing to give up on his mission. Despite the pain and blood loss, he was determined to see his plan through to the end. Back at the mansion, the brothers could see how pale Yui was becoming. Her condition was worsening by the second. Rieji was focused on finding a solution to rid Yui of Cordelia's presence. He was determined to figure out how to expel Cordelia from her body, but time was running out. Richter, on the other hand, had made it back to the room where Cordelia's dress was kept. He reached out for a particular white flower attached to the dress, unaware that Leto had been following him the entire time. Leto had finally pieced everything together. He now understood why Richter had been frequenting their home. The dress was crucial to his plan, the key to taking down their father, Karl-Heinz, and gaining power. Back at the mansion, Rieji had a plan of his own. He had mixed a potion that could rid Yui of Cordelia. The only ingredient he was missing was Cordelia's blood. Fortunately, Kanado had kept a vial of her blood hidden inside his favorite teddy bear, Teddy. With the blood added to the potion, it was finally ready for use. Rieji's concoction was the last hope to free Yui from the nightmare that had gripped her. Meanwhile, Leto returned to the room where Richter was, holding a special lantern. This lantern was not just for light. It was the key to destroying Cordelia's connection to Yui. Without hesitation, Leto set fire to Cordelia's dress and the room itself, reducing everything to ash. He then left, having done his part in helping to break Cordelia's hold. Back at the mansion, Ayato wasn't wasting any time. He took the potion from Rieji and used mouth-to-mouth resuscitation to give it to Yui. After a few tense moments, Yui finally woke up. The darkness that had clouded her mind seemed to lift, and she was herself again. But as she regained consciousness and saw the brothers around her, she felt a strange thirst rising within her, as though Cordelia's presence had left a lasting effect. Later that night, Ayato quietly returned Yui's rosary to her, a symbol of her true self. He handed it to her gently, and with that gesture, the room where Cordelia's memories had once been stored was sealed off. It was a symbolic act, marking the end of Cordelia's influence over Yui's life. Yet, even with Cordelia gone, the strange feeling in Yui's heart remained, hinting that her journey was far from over. But for now, peace had been restored, and Yui was free from the haunting presence that had once controlled her. Ghostly wolves roamed the night, their eerie presence felt beneath the pale glow of the moon. They followed the commands of two brothers, whose hearts burned with the desire to be the founders of the vampire race. They were bent on revenge, chasing a goal that would reshape their world. Meanwhile, Yui was asleep in an unfamiliar place, perched on a tree. Her dreams were strange and fragmented. The only thing that pierced through the fog of sleep was a voice calling to her. "Eve," it whispered, urging her to awaken. Yui opened her eyes to see the flowers on the tree branches bloom, their petals glowing faintly in the moonlight. She felt confused, unable to grasp who was calling her, but before she could understand, the voice faded and she was left in silence. Back at home, the triplets sat by her bedside, watching over her as she slept. They couldn't help but tease her, calling her melodramatic in her sleep. Yet, despite their lightheartedness, they were all craving a drink of her blood. Ayato, always the greedy one, tried to monopolize her blood, but Leto quickly intervened, reminding him that her blood was for everyone. And so, the brothers began to drink from her at once. However, their indulgence was interrupted by Ryuji, who scolded them for being so indecent so early in the day. He was keen on maintaining some form of decorum, but Leto, ever the troublemaker, suggested that Ryuji join in too, calling him out as a hypocrite. Subaru, annoyed, called Leto a pervert, while Shu, uninterested in the drama, simply told everyone to be quiet so he could enjoy his music. Amidst the teasing and bickering, Ayato still longed for more blood, but Ryuji quickly put him in his place, scolding him once again. Kanato, on the other hand, was lost in his conversation with his beloved Teddy, paying no attention to the chaos around him. It was just another ordinary day for the brothers and Yui, until their peaceful routine was violently disrupted. Their limousine suddenly flipped over, crashing into a tree, and exploded. They emerged from the wreckage, unharmed but shaken, trying to figure out who had tried to assassinate them. Their attention turned to four shadowy figures standing above them, watching silently. Ayato, furious, demanded to know who they were, but instead of answering, one of the figures simply spoke the word Eve. The voice was familiar to Yui, sending a chill down her spine. Without another word, the shadowy figures vanished into the night. The brothers didn't like the scent of the four figures. They could tell that the newcomers were vampires, but they weren't like the brothers. These vampires were not purebloods, which only heightened Ayato's anger. He was ready for a fight, feeling that this could very well be a declaration of war. Later that night, Yui was unable to sleep. Her mind was still racing, trying to process the events of the day. The voice calling out to her as Eve echoed in her thoughts. She couldn't shake the feeling that something important was happening, something that tied her to the mysterious events surrounding her. As she wandered outside, lost in her thoughts, the voice called to her again, this time louder and more urgent. Suddenly, a blonde-haired boy appeared behind her. Before she could react, she was surrounded by two more boys, their eyes cold and calculating. Panicking, Yui turned to run back home, but she was quickly stopped by Ruki Mukami and his brothers, who had come for her. The air was thick with tension as Yui realized that her life was about to take an unexpected turn. Yui woke up in a strange, empty room. The eerie quietness was broken by a deep voice that promised everything would become clear in due time. As a hand reached toward her, she suddenly jolted awake, finding herself in an extravagant home, completely unfamiliar to her. Ruki stood nearby, commenting coldly that she slept peacefully, despite being livestock. Confused and frightened, Yui tried to ask why she had been brought here, but before she could get an answer, Yuma slammed his fist against the wall, ordering her to stop making noise. Ku, ever the playful one, chimed in, explaining with a smile that she was simply confused from being brought here so suddenly. The last brother, Azusa, spoke slowly, almost lethargically, asking her if she liked pain, which caused Yui to stumble back onto the couch in shock. The Mukami brothers introduced themselves to Yui and told her that she would be living with them from now on. Yui felt horrified by the situation and tried to run away, but Ruki stopped her with a strong grip. He reminded her that she had been nothing more than a toy at the Sakamaki house. In desperation, she argued that they were all vampires too, so it would be the same if she stayed there. Ruki's eyes darkened at the comparison to the Sakamakis, and he made it clear that he and his brothers had more sense than them. He then revealed that they didn't just need her, they needed her blood, specifically the blood of Eve. Yui was stunned, unable to understand how she could possibly be Eve. But the brothers were certain, as long as she held Eve's blood, she was destined to find Adam. Living under the Mukami brothers' roof, Yui had no say in the matter. She was to follow their rules, and her personal desires meant nothing. Back at the Sakamaki residence, Ayato was growing increasingly frustrated over Yui's disappearance. The other brothers wondered where she had gone, but Shu, ever indifferent, simply told them to let her be, confident that she would eventually return. In her new room, Yui stared at the moon outside the window, lost in thought. She sighed, trying to come to terms with her new reality. Then, she heard a soft click at the door and realized it was unlocked. Seizing the opportunity, she rushed downstairs, running through the hallways, desperately searching for an escape. But no matter where she went, she couldn't find a way out. The ringing of a large bell echoed in her mind, along with the images of apples and the empty room she had left behind. Just as her hopes were beginning to fade, she looked up and saw Ruki standing in front of her. With a cold smirk, he grabbed her and threw her into a nearby room, scolding her for being ill-behaved and trying to escape. He informed her that she would be sleeping in his room that night, and if she tried to run away again, punishment would await her. Yui reluctantly accepted her fate. As she glanced around the room, she noticed an old photo of Ruki. He put it down quickly and walked toward her, surprised that someone as mediocre as Yui could possess the blood of Eve. However, for the brother's cause, he had to drink her blood. Yui gasped in pain as Ruki bit into her neck, and as he drank from her, she screamed. After a moment, Ruki pulled away to inspect the marks he had left on her skin. In a panic, Yui pushed him away, but Ruki wasn't done. He grabbed her from behind, holding her tightly as he continued to drink her blood relentlessly until Yui's vision blurred and she lost consciousness, falling limp in his arms. Yui found herself once again in the strange world. She stood before the same tree and reached out, only to suddenly wake up with a dull ache in her head. Groaning slightly, she got up and made her way to the dining area, where the Mukami brothers were in the middle of a loud argument over their food, specifically fried prawns. Yuma demanded equal portions, while Ku argued that whoever got to them first should have the first serving. Azusa, as always, was indifferent, content to take whatever was offered to him. Ruki, ever the voice of reason, brought more prawns to the table and told his brothers to stop fighting. He then turned to Yui and told her to eat, and she complimented him on his cooking. Watching the brothers interact with one another, Yui felt a strange sense of relief. Their dynamic seemed far more genuine compared to her time with the Sakamaki family. They were more straightforward, despite their flaws, and there was an air of comfort in their bickering. The brothers urged Yui to finish her meal quickly, as they had to leave for school. However, Yui wasn't going. They couldn't risk the Sakamaki brothers taking her back, so Azusa would stay behind to watch over her. Azusa chuckled slightly at this, and his words, though spoken slowly, made Yui uneasy as he seemed too pleased with the idea of spending time alone with her, calling her Eve. Once alone in her room, Yui placed her rosary down and gazed out of the window, only to be startled when Azusa suddenly appeared behind her. With a soft voice, he told her to follow him to his room, where he wanted to show her something. Reluctantly, she followed him and found herself in a room filled with a collection of daggers. Azusa looked at her with a strange intensity as he asked if she loved him. He then followed up with a question that caught her off guard, asking if she could hit him. Yui was shocked and quickly replied that she could never do that. Azusa's expression changed slightly at her answer, and he seemed to think that she disliked him. However, he assured her that he didn't hate her and believed that her scent was similar to his own. With a sparkle in his eye, Azusa took out a freshly sharpened knife and spoke in a way that showed he was almost in awe, saying he wanted to see it cut into her skin because he thought it would be beautiful. Yui flinched and begged him to stop, but when he noticed her fear, Azusa handed her the knife and asked her to cut him instead. Reluctantly, Yui did as he asked, her hand moving quickly, and she sliced him. Azusa smiled, his face lighting up with an unsettling sense of satisfaction. The cut seemed to bring him some twisted sense of joy. He remembered the days he spent in the slums, being bullied by other children. Every time he bled, they seemed happy, which only confused him, but he craved more. He had wanted them to hurt him more, but instead, they had called him a freak and left him behind, though he longed for the pain. For Azusa, pain was his reason for living. It was his proof that he was still alive. The pain Yui had caused him made him feel something, and he was thrilled by it. Even though Yui was distressed by what she had just done, Azusa didn't seem to care. When she tried to run to get something to treat his wound, Azusa stopped her, pressing her against the wall. "There's no need for that," he said softly, before sinking his teeth into her neck from behind. He relished the taste of her blood, describing it as velvety and sweet. He wanted more, greedily sucking at her neck as he praised her blood for being so delicious. When Yui cried out in pain, he agreed, saying that the greater the pain, the better it was. He wanted her to feel everything, as she was his precious Eve. Eventually, Yui passed out from the blood loss, her body going limp. Yuma, hearing the commotion, stepped in and told Azusa that it was enough for now. Azusa, however, lingered on the idea, wondering aloud if he could truly become Adam with Yui's blood, the thought of it lingering in his mind as he stared down at her unconscious form. The days passed quietly at the Mukami estate. Yui, feeling sad, thought about her conversation with Azusa, still unsure about what the Eve thing meant. Then Yuma barged in, calling her a cow, which made her scream so loudly that it hurt his ears. He tried to pull her out of the bath to show her the garden, but she refused until she got dressed. Yuma joked that it wouldn't matter, as no one would be interested in her body, but Yui argued that wasn't the point. Outside, Yui marveled at the tomato garden, which Yuma had grown. He filled a basket with the large tomatoes and explained that if he and his brothers ever ran out of food, these tomatoes could keep them alive for a while. Although vampires didn't need food to survive, he enjoyed eating and didn't mind growing the tomatoes, since they were all originally human. As they picked the tomatoes, Yuma started remembering his time in the slums, where he would have been happy to eat just one tomato. His memories were painful, especially since all his friends had been killed. If it weren't for Lucas, a vampire who had helped him, Yuma would have died there too. Yui asked him to explain more, but Yuma put a tomato in her mouth to silence her. When she praised the tomato's taste, he smiled and then quickly grabbed her, pulling down her shirt to bite her and drink her blood. Yui tried to escape, but Yuma held her tightly and pinned her against the glass of the greenhouse, drinking more from her. She had no choice but to give in to his actions. Years ago, Yuma had been badly beaten and lost track of where he was, thinking he might die in the slums. But then Lucas, one of the first vampires, found him and saved him. Since then, Yuma's life had been much better. Yui woke up with a slight headache and saw a frustrated Yuma. He called her hopeless but then helped her recover by giving her a sugar cube in a mouth-to-mouth gesture. Later, Yui sat by a tree in a mysterious room, and a beautiful flower fell into her hand. Meanwhile, the Mukami brothers gathered in the living room, where Yuma, Azusa, and Ruki discussed that they still hadn't felt any change, despite drinking Eve's blood. Ruki reminded them that they needed to complete the Apple of Adam plan for him, no matter what. Later on, Yui was brushing her hair when Ku came to visit her, still calling her a masochistic kitten, a nickname he had been using all along. He brought her a bouquet of roses, saying it was a sign of friendship. Yui was touched by the beauty and fragrance of the flowers and admired them. However, Ku soon asked for something in return, pulling her close and reminding her that life is about give and take. When Yui pushed him away, Ku's tone became harsh, showing his frustration at her refusal. He angrily complained about how difficult she was being, questioning why he should be nice if she wouldn't give anything back. Then, he took the flowers back, tore off the petals, and stomped on them, claiming he had the right to do so. He grabbed her by the neck and pushed her down to the ground, ready to drink from her. He enjoyed the taste of her blood and whispered in her ear that he wouldn't kill her, at least not until he became Adam. As Yui faded into unconsciousness, she found herself back in the mysterious room. She watched a petal fall from the tree above her before waking up on the floor. She went to the living room, asking the brothers about Ku's whereabouts. They explained he was working and wondered if she was concerned about him. Curious, she went to get some water, pondering what his work could be. Soon after, Ku returned, drenched from the rain, and was happy to see Yui. He playfully asked her to come to his room, acting like a spoiled child who needed help with his buttons. While she undressed him, Yui asked about his work. To her surprise, Ku revealed that he was actually an idol. As she removed his shirt, she noticed the scars on his back, and Ku began to tell her his painful story. He spoke of a boy who had been alone since birth and lived in the sewers. This boy had never seen the outside world, but he longed to gaze at the small round sky visible from a manhole. One day, the boy's dream came true, and he was able to escape the sewers. Filled with hope, he ventured into the outside world, only to be taken to an institution full of other children in similar situations. But there, the boy's life took a darker turn. He was more beautiful than the other children, so he was given better clothes and food. However, he became the prey of wealthy aristocrats, who treated him horribly. Despite his suffering, the boy's beauty made him desirable to those in power. Ku revealed that some people believe that imperfections make things more beautiful. When Yui's face reflected sadness, Ku reassured her, telling her that good things had happened in his life too. He now had brothers, and he grabbed her arm, asking her to sleep with him. Before she could respond, he pulled her into his bed. In a flashback, Yui saw visions of aristocrats telling young Ku that nothing in life came without a price. They reached out toward him as he screamed in terror. Yui woke up to the sound of Ku screaming in his sleep, begging for it all to stop. She reached out to comfort him but hesitated. However, Ku had already grabbed her arm in his sleep, his nightmares continuing to haunt him. Yui gazed up at the tree, watching the petals fall as the sound of a bell rang in the background. It was the day she was going to school with the Mukami brothers, and Ruki had given her a school uniform. As they walked to school, Yui kept an eye out for her old housemates. The Mukami brothers said their goodbyes since none of them had classes with her. On her way, she unexpectedly bumped into Ryeji, who had been wondering where she had been. Before Yui could explain, he quickly interrupted her, saying he wasn't interested in where she had been or who she was with. Then Leto appeared from behind, calling her cruel and accusing her of abandoning them to have fun with the Mukami brothers. Kanado also seemed upset, especially since Yui had disappeared with people he didn't consider real vampires. As she looked around, asking where Ayato was, the boys disappeared in an instant. Meanwhile, Yuma was heading up the stairs but stopped when he saw Shu lying across his path. Yuma, annoyed, called Shu a neat and told him to move. Shu lazily responded that he could sleep wherever he wanted and that Yuma could pass if he wanted to, which only irritated Yuma more. By one of the exits, Yui saw Ku surrounded by a group of girls, clearly popular due to his idol status. Just then, Subaru suddenly grabbed her and pulled her aside, hurting her with his grip. He pinned her against the gate, demanding to know if she left on her own free will. Yui didn't give him a clear answer, and before long, Ku appeared, smirking and telling Yui to tell Subaru the truth. He teased Subaru, suggesting that if he liked her, he should just take her. Ku added that if Subaru didn't want her, he would. This made Subaru furious, and in a snap, he pulled Yui back and bit into her shoulder. After the impulsive action, Subaru seemed to realize how foolish he was being and decided to leave Yui behind. Ku, observing the bite mark on her neck, decided to deepen the wound so no one would be able to tell that Subaru had bitten her. Back in Yuma's tomato garden, he decided to ask Yui more about Shu, the eldest Sakamaki brother. Yui described him as a quiet boy who mostly kept to himself, listened to music, and slept a lot at home. This only reinforced Yuma's impression of Shu as a neat, but just thinking about Shu still made him angry. Meanwhile, Ruki observed them from a window and overheard Ku and Azusa discussing how there had still been no signs of an awakening. Despite drinking Yui's blood, Ku wondered if maybe not enough time had passed yet, and Ruki accepted that explanation, reflecting on his own past. He remembered the times when he and his brothers were on the run from pursuers, beaten and hunted. It wasn't until their vampire father, Lucas Sakamaki, took them in that things began to change. Ruki didn't want to disappoint him. On another school day, Yui suddenly lost her balance and started to fall down the stairs, but Yuma caught her just in time. Feeling dizzy, she fell against his chest, and Yuma, worried about her, decided to carry her. As they made their way to class, they came across Shu, who was lounging in the hallway. Yuma told Shu to move out of the way, kicking the floor where Shu was lying. Shu lazily woke up and greeted them with a casual acknowledgement of Yuma. Yui, wanting to be polite, said good morning to him, and Shu remarked that he had noticed she had left and assumed she was now living with the Mukami brothers, calling her immoral for it. Yuma and Shu began bickering, with Yuma expressing his hatred for Shu's aristocratic attitude. In an attempt to strike a nerve, Yuma suddenly bit into Yui's neck, drinking her blood fiercely until Shu was irritated enough to get up and leave. Yui wondered why Yuma would do such a thing, but for Yuma, it was a power play. He wanted to prove that not everything could go the way of some aristocratic brat. As they continued walking through the halls, Shu suddenly had a flashback to when he met Yuma as a child. Back then, Yuma was polite and kind, offering Shu an apple he had grown. However, Shu had thought the boy's name was Edgar. He began to question whether they were really the same person. From above, Ryuji, who had overheard the entire exchange, wondered how Edgar had ended up becoming a vampire. Back at the Mukami house, Ruki suddenly grabbed Yui to drink her blood but then stopped, his hand trembling. He looked disturbed and turned away. Once inside his room, Ruki doubted whether he and his brothers could ever truly become Adam. But he quickly steeled himself and told himself they must, no matter what. At dinner, Yuma and Ku were once again arguing over their portions of food. Azusa, sitting down, explained that Ruki wasn't joining them because he didn't want any food. The brothers were concerned, wondering what had been bothering Ruki lately and why he seemed to be in such a bad mood. This made Yui reflect on the time Ruki had grabbed her but chose not to drink her blood. Inside his room, Ruki was frustrated and threw his book against the wall, clearly upset with how things were progressing. Meanwhile, as Yui was getting ready for school, Ruki suddenly grabbed her and dragged her down the hall. He threw her into a room and demanded she stay there for the time being. He quickly bit into her, drinking her blood until she collapsed. Yet, even after feeding, he remained unsettled. Outside the room, he stared at his hand, and his younger brothers asked what was wrong. He replied that they had been too lenient lately, and that this was how livestock should be treated. From now on, they would demand even more of her blood in their quest to become Adam. The younger brothers were concerned, asking how long Ruki intended to keep Yui locked in the room, as a week had already passed. Ruki coldly responded that Prey didn't need freedom and reminded them of the promise they made to their father. However, the brothers felt uneasy about how weak Yui was becoming and believed Ruki was acting too hastily. Frustrated, Ruki slammed his fist against the wall but then noticed Ayato standing outside, watching them from the window. The air around Ayato was thick with the pressure of a true pure-blooded vampire from a noble family, and his presence was overwhelming. Ayato swiftly made his way to Yui's room and, without hesitation, scolded her for being nothing but trouble. He immediately took her away before the Mukami brothers could react. Yuma and Ku were furious, wondering why Ruki didn't try to stop Ayato. But Ruki simply stated there was no need to. When Azusa asked what they would do now, Ruki only thought about how he was powerless to confront Ayato. Outside, Ayato pushed Yui up against a tree, ready to drink from her. But when he noticed the bruises on her neck from the brutal feedings of the past week, he was angry at the blood she had let them take from her. Despite this, he drank from her anyway, reminding her that she belonged to him. He drank deeply, saying he would carve it into her body so she'd never forget. As the rain fell around them, Yui slowly lost consciousness. Back at the Mukami residence, each of the brothers sat alone in their rooms, frustrated and deep in thought. Meanwhile, the tree outside withered, and the gears of the room came to an eerie halt. Yui woke up feeling disoriented, finding herself back in her old room. As she tried to recall the events of the previous day, she couldn't help but wonder why the tree had died. Leto was the first to greet her, commenting on how tired she looked from all the blood Ayato had taken from her. He seemed to take pleasure in her weakened state and mentioned how much he missed her. He even seemed to get excited by the thought of what the Mukami brothers had been doing to her, which made Yui uncomfortable. He pulled the sheets away, and despite her begging him to stop, he continued to feed on her, focusing on his favorite spot, her legs. He found her reactions irresistible, intending to make her feel so good that she would forget everything. However, Ryuji interrupted Leto, demanding to know everything Yui knew about the Mikami brothers. In the living room, Ryuji pressed her for information, and when he learned that they had been calling her Eve, he couldn't help but laugh. He considered their plans futile, aware of their intentions. Kanado appeared soon after, upset and accusing Yui of coming and going as she pleased. He made it clear he wouldn't forgive her, no matter how much she cried or begged. Subaru then entered, questioning if she had enjoyed living with the Mikami brothers. Yui tried to explain that she had been kidnapped, but Subaru only responded by slamming his fist against the wall. The scene felt all too familiar, reminding her of something from the past. Leto teased Subaru for missing Yui, and Ayato then stepped in, stating that he didn't want any mention of the Mikami brothers' names within the household. Ryuji had called a meeting with all the brothers to discuss an upcoming event, a rare lunar eclipse that would occur simultaneously in both the human and demon worlds. During this eclipse, vampire powers would weaken drastically, and they needed to prepare for potential dangers. The event was not something they could take lightly. Later that night, Yui entered Ryuji's room, seeking answers about the Eve and the Mikami brothers' mysterious plan. Ryuji smirked and told her there was no need for her to know, as the brothers would never be able to carry out their plan. He then pushed her against a desk, calling her foolish for thinking she was special because of her blood. As he went to feed, he reminded her of the sweet scent of her blood, which drove everyone mad. The thought of the other brothers stealing her blood angered him deeply, as Shu continued to feed on Yui. He cruelly mocked her, suggesting that as long as she was having her blood drained, it didn't matter who did it. Yui cried out in pain, but Shu seemed to enjoy her discomfort, almost relishing the way she reacted as if begging for more. His bite grew harsher as he sank his teeth into her hand, watching her blood drip from her fingertips. He praised her as the finest quality prey, making it clear he wasn't ready to let her go back to the Mikami brothers. Meanwhile, in the Mikami household, the brothers were left uneasy and frustrated by Ruki's unusual behavior. Ku, Azusa, and Yuma wondered why Ruki hadn't fought to keep Yui, especially after hearing his nervous response about the no sign of awakening. They had never seen their older brother so anxious or uncertain. But their worry soon turned into alarm when demonic wolves burst through the window, trapping them in their own home. For once, they were the ones in danger, becoming prey instead of the predators. Back at the other location, Yui wandered toward the now withered apple tree, reaching out as if to touch it. But before she could, the sound of a bell rang, signaling something ominous. The tree crumbled into glittering dust, and suddenly, the scene shifted, pulling her back to reality. Kanado, noticing her distant expression, demanded to know what she was thinking. When she didn't answer in the way he desired, he called her a traitor and asked why she had left. He angrily claimed that she was nothing more than his toy, and without hesitation, he began to drink from her once more. Before Kanado could continue, an injured Azusa burst into the room. He explained that Ruki was in danger, prompting Yui to move toward him in concern. But Kanado tightly gripped her hand, refusing to let her go. In his fury, he threatened to kill both Yui and Azusa right then and there. Azusa, desperate, begged Yui to return to the Mikami brothers, further enraging Kanado, who shouted at Azusa to leave. Kanado, now utterly enraged by Yui's resistance, snapped. He believed the only way to resolve things was to kill her. He grabbed her neck, knowing that human life was fragile and could easily be extinguished. But Azusa, in a desperate bid to save Yui, grabbed Kanado's precious teddy bear and threw it into the fire. As the bear burned, Kanado screamed in anguish and rushed to try to save it, allowing Azusa the opportunity to pull Yui away from the scene. The distraction was enough for them to escape, though Kanado was left broken and devastated by the loss of his beloved toy. Back at the Mikami house, everything was in disarray following the attack. Yui, battered and bandaged, had returned to Ruki's side. Azusa explained that Ruki had protected them all during the assault. When the demon wolves attacked, the brothers had tried to defend themselves. But it was Ruki who took the brunt of the blow when Azusa had been caught alone. Ruki's selflessness had spared them, but he was now injured and weakened. Yui, still concerned, asked why the wolves had attacked in the first place, but the brothers had no answers. Outside Ruki's room, the brothers shared their concerns. They mentioned how their older brother had been acting strangely lately and speculated that the pressure of their failed plan to awaken Adam had gotten to him. They explained the entire plan to Yui. One of them was supposed to become Adam by awakening, but Ruki, especially, had been feeling the weight of that failure. The brothers sympathized with Ruki, knowing that it was because of him that they now had better lives. They had spent their childhoods in struggle, but Ruki had worked hard to bring them together and give them something better. Yui, staring out of the window, noticed Ruki was waking up. When he realized she had returned and heard about his injuries, he coldly dismissed her concern, saying it was none of her business. Yui tried to bring up the Apple of Adam plan, but Ruki didn't want to hear about it. He shut her down and admitted that the plan had been futile. He confessed his deep sense of defeat, realizing that none of them, non-purebloods, could ever become Adam. Only purebloods had that right, and this was something he could never admit to his younger brothers. Yui, sensing his pain, gently reasoned with him, suggesting that the younger brothers might have already known the truth. They had always relied on Ruki, and she believed that it wasn't just his failure, it was the result of something beyond their control. This caused Ruki to reflect on the time he spent with his brothers when they were younger. He realized how much they had depended on him, yet he had always thought of them as nothing more than livestock. But now, with Yui's words and her unwavering support, something had changed in him. He no longer saw her just as the prey or a means to an end. He wanted her for himself, and only himself. In a rare moment of vulnerability, Ruki pulled Yui close, telling her to stay with him. He began to feed on her, but gently this time, his touch softer as he held her, a silent acknowledgement of his desire to keep her close. He wanted to be the one who took care of her, not just for his brothers, but for himself. Meanwhile, the two brothers Shin and Carlo, who had been plotting in the shadows, prepared to unleash the wolves again. With the impending lunar eclipse, the vampire's powers were set to diminish, but for these two powerful founders, it would be a time of heightened strength. Their true goal was not only to survive the eclipse but to claim Yui's blood, believing it was the key to unlocking unimaginable power. The Sakamaki residence was in chaos as the demonic wolves attacked. Ayato was caught in the midst of the assault, narrowly avoiding one that lunged at him. The wolves were tearing through the place, causing destruction everywhere, and Ayato was left wondering what the real reason behind this attack was. Both Ryuji and Shu, having assessed the situation, concluded that the attack was likely connected to the remaining survivors of the founders. The wolves had retreated without finishing them off, and it soon became clear to the brothers that Yui was the true target. With the lunar eclipse approaching its peak, Shu warned Ayato that the founders would be at their maximum strength during the event. However, Ayato wasn't about to let that stop him. He wasn't going to allow anyone to take Yui. She was his, and he would protect her at all costs. Meanwhile, Yui was on her way to bring water to Ruki when Ayato appeared suddenly behind her, informing her of the situation. He told her that the founders would likely make their move once the eclipse reached its peak, and they were hunting her blood. Ruki, realizing the danger they were in, proposed an uneasy alliance with Ayato to protect Yui from the coming threat. Ayato agreed, but with his own conditions. He bit Yui's neck, reminding everyone that she was his. Ruki wasn't willing to give up so easily, though. He, too, bit her, declaring that Yui was his one and only Eve. The two were feeding on Yui, and while the situation was dire, neither of them seemed willing to back down from their claim over her. Yui, caught between the two, was left vulnerable as the brothers feasted on her blood. It was a tense moment, with the lunar eclipse nearing its peak, and Yui, caught in the middle, was not only a target of the founders but also the object of their rivalry. As the moon slowly moved toward its full eclipse, Ruki couldn't help but reflect on Yui's circumstances. He compared her to his past, seeing her as someone whose freedom had been stripped away, someone who had been imprisoned and made to suffer, just as he once had. But now, he was determined that things would be different. He believed that the true awakening of Adam could only happen when Eve had freedom of choice, when she could make her own decisions. Earlier, Ruki had asked Yui if she wanted their protection, seeking her opinion because he wanted to be freely chosen by her. In his eyes, the only way for them to truly become Adam and Eve was if she had the freedom to choose without being forced. Thanks for watching till this long, my fellow men of culture. Don't forget to tell us about your favorite waifu from this anime and subscribe to the channel for more content.